Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ellen Jane Moss, a member of the Exposomic and Children's Environmental Health Board at Mount Sinai. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third annual Environmental and Health Series. During the next 6 weeks, on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock, you will meet top scientists studying the connections between health and complex environmental exposures. We aim to provide you with the latest environmental health discoveries and actionable ways we all can reduce harmful environmental exposures in our everyday lives. I encourage you to take an active part in the forthcoming sessions, submit questions, and raise any concerns you would like us to address in future talks. As a board member, I am regularly asked, what is the exposome? Think of it as a person's environmental exposure across their whole life. We get exposed to chemicals like pesticides, heavy metals. There's air pollution, climate changes, stress, and lifestyle factors like exercise. The list is long with data points in the millions. But the technology exists to do this. The next question is always, well, how can you measure all those things together and make sense of them? This is where exposomics comes into play. Between lab tests, smartwatches, and satellites, we already collect environmental data on a grand scale. Exposomics is about bringing all this data together to make sense of it. Sophisticated new technologies have played a major role in the growth of this field. Building on advances in environmental health, and integrating those with statistical analysis that can address the complexities of big data have moved exposomics at a rapid pace, making inroads into diseases such as autism, obesity, ALS, and cancer. These advances have been made in large part to scientists at Mount Sinai, like Dr. Dania Valvi, who you will hear from today. Today's discussion will revolve around PFAS, chemicals that are found in everyday products that are linked with multiple diseases and health conditions. PFAS, which is short for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, is a very large class of chemicals used in water, oil, and heat-resistant coatings on products. PFAS are considered forever chemicals, meaning that they do not break down in the environment and accumulate in water sources, wildlife, and our bodies. There are thousands of PFAS that may be present in consumer products and in the environment, but very few have been comprehensively tested for toxicity. This presentation today will be about 25 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of audience questions. I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and if we can't get to them all, we will work to get answers shared on social media. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Valvi. Dr. Valvi is a physician and an environmental epidemiologist. She's assistant professor and the co-director of the master's program in epidemiology in the Department of Environmental Medicine and Public Health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Valvi's research focuses on how exposure to environmental chemicals such as PFAS impact human health. Her studies aim to develop our understanding of disease mechanisms, how our genes interact with our environment, and the discovery of new exposure and disease biomarkers. Prior to joining Mount Sinai in 2019, Dr. Valvi was a research scientist at an institute in Barcelona, and then at Harvard Th Chan School of Public Health, where she also completed her postdoctoral fellowship in environmental health. Dr. Valvi holds a medical degree from the Medical School of the University of Crete in Greece, and a master's of public health and a PhD in epidemiology from Pompeu Fabra University in Spain. I'm delighted to introduce her to you today. And with that, Dr. Valvi, please take the stage.
Thank you, Ellen Zane. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and let's see how this works. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So thank you so much for this nice introduction and for having me today to talk about PFAS. I have been studying PFAS and many other chemicals and their impact on our health for almost 15 years now with colleagues here at our Institute for Exposomic Research and with many other researchers from the United States and other countries. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity today to talk about some of the things that we have learned over the years about PFAS and the risks these chemicals pose to our health. So to give you a bit of background, what first triggered my interest and the interest of many other scientists around the world to aim to understand the role of chemical exposures on our health is the fact that we have seen some very sharp rises in the prevalence of many chronic diseases in the last decades. And we have also noted that these rises have been parallel to the rise in chemical production after the 1940s. So as an example here, I saw in this graph the dramatic rise in diabetes prevalence in the United States. That's the line that we see in red. And the parallel rise in US synthetic organic chemical production, that's the line in blue. So today, diabetes is a very important epidemic that now affects 1 in every 10 adults here in the United States. And we have seen similar rises also for other diseases, such as obesity, chronic liver disease, and certain types of cancer. Now, well, the fact that these phenomena are correlated does not necessarily mean that chemicals actually cause these diseases. And we know that there have been other changes over this period, such as behavioral changes and changes in our diet. However, today we know enough to know from very robust evidence from both laboratory and human studies that many chemical exposures can affect our health. And in this way, increase our risk for diabetes, among other very severe diseases. And this is an important public health problem because right now, we also know that there are more than 150,000 man-made chemicals in the world markets. And out of those, there are only very few that have been tested properly, and we know the ways they can impact our health. But there are so many other chemicals out there that may or may not impact our health, for which we know too little because we haven't properly tested them. So this is a big problem that we should all be thinking how to address in the future collectively together, not only scientists, but all of us together as a society. So what many studies in the past 20, 30 years have shown is that there is this very big group of dangerous chemicals that we refer to as endocrine disrupting chemicals or hormone disruptors. These are some of the terms that you may have heard also in the media, in which PFAS and many other chemicals belong. So to give you the big picture, some other examples that you may have heard of are certain plasticizers such as BPA or BPS and phthalates, some flame retardants, or some heavy metals such as lead and mercury. These are chemicals for which we know that they can interfere and really mess up with our endocrine system because they have similar structure with some natural hormones. And therefore, once they are inside our body, they can trick our cells into thinking they are an actual hormone, or they can block a natural hormone from fulfilling its action. And this can trigger many abnormal processes in our body. And if this keeps happening for a long period of time, it can eventually lead to severe health consequences, such as the onset of diabetes or other chronic diseases. So something important to take out from here is that today we are talking about PFAS, but there are many other endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, out there that have contaminated our environment and can also have a very bad impact to our health. And these chemical exposures are widespread. They have contaminated the water we drink, the food we eat, and in this way, we are all exposed to them. So why are we so concerned about PFAS? There are several good reasons for that. The first is that this is a particularly big class of chemicals released in our environment. The US Environmental Protection Agency estimates that there are over 9,000 compounds that fall into the PFAS category. So this is a really big class of chemicals. We also know that PFAS are very mobile in the environment, and in this way, they have been detected in all parts of the world, even in the Arctic, that's very far from industrial sites. So we are facing a widespread global contamination problem when it comes to PFAS. In addition, we know that many PFAS are very highly resistant to degradation because they have this structure that I saw here for PFOS and PFOA. These are two of the PFASs most widely studied. And as you can see, they have many carbon-fluorine bonds. So carbon-fluorine bonds, we know that are very strong and do not break easily down. And this is why PFAS are usually referred to as forever chemicals, because of their extreme persistence in the environment. What does this mean is that once PFAS are released in our environment, they stay there for years and they will accumulate in the food chain and humans. As a result, human biomonitoring studies show that more than 99% of people who have been tested have a mixture of some PFAS in their blood. This has been shown in populations here in the United States, but also all over the world. So all of us have some PFAS in our body. Because PFAS make materials very resistant to oil, stains, water, and heat, they have been widely used in several consumer products and other applications since the 1950s. And this has led to this widespread global contamination PFAS problem that we face today. But it was not until the early 20s that we started figuring out their impacts on our health. And that was in large part because we started to notice that there is high detection of PFAS in drinking water, especially here in the United States. This is a graphic that shows how PFAS are released and transported in the environment. And the reason why I'm showing this is to highlight that there are multiple ways contributing to this widespread contamination problem. Of course, a major one is from the direct release of PFAS in groundwater and the atmosphere, and solid waste from industries that produce or use PFAS in their manufacture. Another way through we all contribute to this problem, perhaps without even knowing it, is when, for example, we throw some things that we do not need anymore that contain PFAS, like an old jacket or our rain boots. And these things will go out to a landfill, and from there we can have further release of PFAS contaminating the environment. And as I said, PFAS are very mobile and can transport through water and air very long distances, which explains why we are detecting PFAS even in places far away from industries and landfills. So this is a very complex contamination problem, and there is not much that we can do to get rid of PFAS once they are released in the environment. So the most effective way to get rid of this contamination is to actually stop producing and using PFAS in the first place. And there have been efforts in recent years by the Environmental Protection Agency and some US states, like here, the New York State, to tackle this problem. But unfortunately, current regulations are not enough to address the problem and protect our health from these chemicals. The most common routes through which we are exposed to PFAS is by consuming contaminated drinking water, contaminated food, and through the use of everyday products that contain PFAS. Some people may also be more highly exposed to PFAS through their work. For example, we know that PFAS are used a lot in firefighting foams, and therefore firefighters can have an additional very important exposure to PFAS through their occupation. But even if that's not our case, all of us are somehow exposed to PFAS through the water we drink, the food we eat, or everyday products that we use. So as I mentioned, PFAS can make products very resistant to oil, water, and stains, and therefore are broadly used in several everyday products. Examples are non-stick pans, microwaved popcorn bags, fast food packaging through which PFAS can contaminate our food, for example, pizza boxes. They are also found in waterproof clothing, such as our jacket and rain boots, in water and stain-resistant carpets and furniture that we may have in our home, in floor treatment waxes, and more recent studies have shown that PFAS can be found even in our dental floss, certain cosmetics like lipsticks and concealers, and the list goes on and on. So if you have been following the news recently, for example, you may have also heard about PFAS that are found in period underwear. So because PFAS are found in so many everyday products, this makes our exposure to PFAS very hard to avoid. And one reason for that is the fact that PFAS, similar to other dangerous chemicals, are not properly disclosed in product labels. So we cannot easily recognize which products contain PFAS. In some occasions, for example, you may have seen a product labeled as not having PFOS or PFOA or few other PFASs, but this does not mean that this product does not have other PFASs or other dangerous chemicals that may also be bad for our health. This is a very interesting study that I'm showing here on product labels that was published last year, which found PFAS in several products meant to be used by children and adolescents, like clothes and bedding sets, among many others. This study also found that all products that were tested and labeled as water or stain resistant contained some type of PFAS. And this was true even for water and stain resistant products that had some type of a green assurance. So even if we see an eco-friendly or green label, this cannot guarantee us that this product does not contain PFAS. The other important message here is that a possible way to reduce our exposure to PFAS is by avoiding the use of products that are labeled as water and stain resistant, because chances are that they will contain some PFAS in them. And the reason why this is very important to try to avoid exposure to PFAS is because today we have good evidence from both laboratory and population studies that show that higher exposure to PFAS is associated with increased risk for many diseases in adults, but also children. So in regard to children, this is an especially vulnerable group to PFAS exposures because we know that PFAS can pass from the mother to the child through the placenta in pregnancy and also through breast milk after birth. And also children are moving closer to the ground where PFAS can settle in dust in our home, for example. Because of this, in many occasions, we have seen that young children can have even higher PFAS concentrations in their blood compared to their parents. And this is very concerning because we know that environmental chemical exposures in pregnancy and early life can alter children's development and can increase risk for many chronic diseases later in adulthood. So children can have very long-lasting effects on their health due to these early life exposures. So some of the effects that PFAS have been linked to are developmental effects and low birth weight when this exposure occurs in pregnancy. We've also seen that PFAS can alter thyroid function in children and adults. PFAS are also seen to impact our immune system and reduce antibody response after vaccination. Some studies in very highly contaminated communities have shown that high exposure to certain PFAS may increase the risk for certain types of cancer, like testicular and kidney cancer. And we also have very strong evidence that PFAS exposures can have multiple adverse cardiometabolic effects and can increase our cholesterol levels, our blood pressure, our risk for diabetes. And more recently, we have seen that PFAS may increase our risk also for chronic liver disease. And as I said, these effects can start very early in life. As an example here, I show you one of the recent studies we published where we analyzed a large set of exposure data from 6 European countries using some advanced biostatistical methods. And what we found is that prenatal exposure to PFAS, as well as other endocrine disrupting chemicals, including metals, flame retardants, and some pesticides, is increasing significantly the risk of children for liver injury and liver disease at the age of 8 years. Oops. Okay. And we have seen that the adverse metabolic effects by PFAS exposures in humans can be due to alterations in many important biological pathways that regulate our metabolism. In this figure, I show a summary of a recent systematic review of the biomedical literature that we conducted, where we found consistent evidence supporting that PFAS can alter multiple metabolic pathways in children and adults. For example, important molecular pathways that regulate the way our body metabolizes lipids, proteins, and sugars, among many other pathways. And it is very likely that PFAS may affect our health in various other ways that we have not studied as much yet. So every day there are more and more studies getting published suggesting other potential health effects due to PFAS exposure, such as effects on our reproductive health or on children's neurodevelopment. As an example, in one of our recent studies that is currently under peer review, we found that higher PFAS exposure could decrease fertility in women of reproductive age who are naturally trying to conceive. Our study is coming to add to the good evidence that we now have about the role of other indices on fertility and reproductive health. And one of our colleagues here at Mount Sinai, Dr. Swan, published a book on this topic a couple of years ago that you may find of interest, explaining, based on robust scientific evidence, how chemicals such as phthalates and other indices can contribute to the declines in fertility we are seeing for both men and women in our modern societies. We do not know as much about PFAS and fertility yet, and we need more studies to understand how PFAS may affect fertility. But I'm using our recent study here as an example to highlight that it is very likely that there are even more health risks linked to PFAS exposures, and we may not yet fully appreciate all the risks that PFAS pose to our health. So much of the work we are doing now in my lab here at the Institute for Exposomic Research aims to better understand how PFAS and more broadly environmental exposure shape our health over the lifespan. Some of the things that we are looking at is to understand how complex mixtures of environmental chemicals may interact with our genes, our diet, or other environmental exposures in causing diseases, and what are the implicated molecular mechanisms that mediate these effects of environmental exposures on disease in humans. And just to give you an example for the way we do that, this is a new large epidemiology study for which we recently received support by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, where our focus is to investigate the effects of a large number of PFAS on diabetes. Some of these PFAS have not been previously studied. And one of our goals is to understand how PFAS may interact with our genes in causing diabetes. And the way we will do that is by generating environmental exposure data for patients participating in the BioMe biobank. BioMe is a very large and very diverse biobank that we have here at Mount Sinai. There are more than 65,000 patients who have agreed to participate in BioMe, for who we have in-depth clinical information from their medical records. We have broad genetic characterization, and we have now started to generate data for about 2,000 of these patients about their environmental exposures and disease biomarkers using some novel high-resolution exposomics approaches that we have developed here at the Institute for Exposomic Research. Here you can see my collaborators from Mount Sinai and the University of Southern California that are involved in this research. So this research is important because findings will allow us to understand how we can use environmental chemical exposures to inform better prevention and intervention strategies to tackle the diabetes epidemic that we face today. And because BioMe is also very highly diverse in terms of ethnicity and social factors, results from this research may help us also to better understand some of the ethnic and social disparities we see in diabetes. So before opening for questions, I would very much like to thank you all for joining us today and for your attention. And I would like to acknowledge all my colleagues here at the Institute for Exposomic Research who have contributed to the studies I talked about today. In this picture, you can see some of the very talented fellows and students from my research group here at Mount Sinai. I would also like to thank all my collaborators from many other institutions in the United States and globally. You see the institutions listed on the right. They are so many names to be listed here that it's not possible. But what I want to highlight is that science requires a great team effort. And this work could not have happened without this amazing network of colleagues and collaborators that I'm very fortunate to work with, as well as the generous contribution of all the people and the communities that have participated in our research studies. And I will stop here, and I will be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Valvi. Before we start the Q&A, I want to encourage everyone to spend some time on our website at mountsinaiexposomics.org, where we have terrific resources that break down science, or you can follow us across social media platforms at Sinai Exposomics. If you have more questions or have concerns in your own community, from questions about pesticide use in public parks to access to healthy foods to clean water, our scientists are available to speak and provide that data that underpin sound policies that promote healthy environments. Don't hesitate to contact us. We are excited to announce that nominations are now open for new members to join our board. As a member of our board, you will have the opportunity to work with leading experts in the field and play a critical role in shaping the direction of exposomic research. We welcome nominations of individuals from diverse backgrounds and disciplines who are committed to promoting the understanding of environmental exposures and their impact on human health. We encourage you to nominate yourself or a colleague who you believe would make a valuable addition to our board. Together, we can continue to make a significant impact in the field of exposomics and support efforts to improve human health and well-being. We are going to move forward to some of the questions. Dr. Valvi, I imagine you are very deliberate with the research that you do and how you evaluate products for your family, especially food choices. Can you give us some insights into what people should look for when shopping?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are a few things that we can do to reduce our exposure to PFAS. One way related to food is by decreasing the amount of fast food that we eat. It's always better for our health to eat fresh foods that we prepare at home, rather than packaged or wrapped takeout foods, because we know that many of these food packages may contain PFAS. It's also important the way we cook our food. So we know that non-stick pans and other cookware can contain PFAS. So avoiding their use can help to reduce to some extent our exposure. So we can use instead stainless or cast iron pans that are considered, at least based on the knowledge that we have today, safer options for cooking. Something else that we can do is to use the certified water filter that can remove PFAS and other chemicals from our tap water. And whenever we're thinking about buying a new product, a general rule that we can try to avoid to the extent possible is to avoid buying water and stain-resistant products, as we have seen that many of these products contain PFAS. These are a few things that we can do to reduce our exposure, and these are a few of the things that I'm trying to do. But it is almost impossible to completely avoid exposure to PFAS, because PFAS are found in so many everyday products, and there is this widespread contamination. So to really be able to solve this problem, it is important also to advocate for stronger regulations that limit PFAS production and use. And I think we can also advocate for the right that we have as consumers to know what chemicals potentially dangerous for our health are included in a product that we are thinking of buying. Today we have product labels that tells us how much sugar or how much salt there is in a food. So can't we have also labels that tells us what PFAS or other chemicals are used in a product that we're thinking of using?
Thank you. What about non-chemical exposures like stress or poverty? How can you take into account the social aspects of the environment?
Yes, so this is a very important question, and the reason is that the more we study the exposome, the exposome is about the totality of environmental exposures that occur over our lifespan and how these exposures can shape our health, right? So the more we study the exposome, the more we appreciate its complexity. And the exposome has many things in it. It's not just chemicals, it's not just our diet. There are important social factors and psychosocial stress that are very strong determinants for our health. There are exposures related to the neighborhood where we live, the built environment that is surrounding us, and so many other environmental exposures. And we know that these exposures do not happen in isolation. So to give you an example, people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged can have also higher exposures to certain chemicals, may not have the same food choices or food security compared to others, and can be more vulnerable to the vast impacts of climate change. So all these factors can jointly contribute to the severe health disparities that we see today. So to understand this complexity, today we use novel, what we call exposome-wide approaches, where we try to measure as much as possible of social and other environmental exposures in populations, such as BioMe, the study example that I showed earlier, with the goal to understand not only how different exposome components shape our health. I mean, we already know that social determinants are so important for our health, right? But what I think is of greater interest is understanding their interplay and through which mechanisms this is happening, which will allow us to come up with better strategies to address these issues in the future.
Sorry, my computer wasn't working. So we are very concerned. Many are concerned about environmental exposures during critical windows of development, such as during pregnancy or a child's early years. Are your recommendations any different, or what are your recommendations for expecting or new parents?
Yeah, this is a question that I hear very often, and it's a very critical question because the early life environment plays such an important role for shaping health and disease in later life. So here it is important to remember that it's not only PFAS that we are concerned about. There are so many other EDCs, like plasticides, for example, that pose a risk to our health, but also to our newborns and children. So other than the things that I mentioned before that we can do to reduce our PFAS exposure, we can also focus on doing a more responsible use of products that contain EDCs more broadly, especially in pregnancy, which can be good for our baby's health, but also can be very good for the environment. So something that can help is every time we're thinking of buying or using a product, maybe ask ourselves, do I really need this? Considering the possible risks for my health and my children's health. And to give you for a few examples, one is we can limit our use of plastic food containers or water bottles and substitute it by glass containers or bottles, which are a safer option when it comes to chemical exposures and especially to endocrine disrupting chemicals. We can limit the use of cosmetics and perfumes that we know that contain some of these dangerous chemicals. And we can try whenever possible to eat organic fruits and vegetables that we know can have lower levels of pesticides. And I cannot stress enough how important it is for expecting moms to eat healthy and maintain a healthy weight gain and keep up with taking their supplements and vitamins as recommended by their physician, because we have lots of evidence that show that these things are very important for our babies to have a good and healthy start and to maintain healthier also later in childhood and adult life.
Thank you. Can you talk about the importance of levels of exposure to PFAS? Are they different if the exposures are higher versus lower?
So
are the health effects different if it's higher versus lower?
Yes. So our studies have covered the full range of PFAS exposures that we see in the population. And the bad news here is that we see adverse health effects of PFAS even at very low exposure levels, which reflects how toxic these chemicals can be. So definitely communities that have been very highly exposed to PFAS for a long time can be the most vulnerable. But because we see that even low levels of exposures that we see, background levels that we see in the population are associated with adverse health effects, we cannot think that because we are too little or too much exposed to PFAS, that we are out of the hook, that we are not into a danger.
Thank you. What about, this has been in the news recently, talking about PFAS in fish, particularly freshwater fish. Is there a recommendation for types of fish that people should be eating or avoiding?
Yes, unfortunately, we don't have that many data to be able to know exactly what types of fish are have higher levels of PFAS. Here, I think it is important to mention that fish has also some good fatty acids and other things that are very nutritious and good for our health. So related to fish consumption, because this is also a question that I usually get, I think it is important to try to keep a moderate consumption of fish. And keep in mind that, yes, it can be a source of chemicals, but it can also have very beneficial effects to our health.
And I think we actually have a resource we might be able to put in the chat or follow up with people on about which fishes are better versus worse. And I can try and follow up with that, or we can send it out. We're starting to get toward the end, so I'm going to wrap up with two more quick ones. One, PFAS related to artificial turf, and do you have concerns? And then secondly, tap water in New York City. Are there concerns there? And should you try to use filtered water and even for cooking?
Yeah, so I will start with the second question. So New York State is trying to update the safety limits for PFAS in drinking water, and that's good. That's a progress. But unfortunately, these regulations are taking into account on only few PFASs. And sometimes the safety limits proposed, they're not good enough, because we see that even exposures at lower levels on the long term can accumulate in our body. So we need to do much better than that. And we need to think about regulating PFAS as a class. For example, and really tackle the problem of producing PFAS and using them in the first place. So as an example, there has been very recently, there was a proposal from 5 European countries, Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Sweden, a proposal to European Union to ban the use of almost 10,000 PFASs. So they are really trying to tackle PFAS as a chemical class. And I think that's the direction that we need to be moving forward. Just regulating few PFAS is not going to solve this global contamination problem that we are facing today.
I'm right, and then I guess it was the artificial turf question, and then we'll wrap up.
So I'm not sure I understand this question. Maybe you can.
It's just if are you concerned with PFAS exposures in artificial turf, like being used on playgrounds and sports fields?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that playgrounds can be a source of several chemicals for our kids. You know, we used to have things made by wood. Now everything is made by synthetic materials that can have several endocrine disruptors. And of course, you know, the kids are moving very close to this playground toys, and they can inhale dangerous chemicals through that. They also sweat and they touch these things. So, you know, they may have other routes of exposure to these chemicals like dermal absorption. So definitely that's, you know, an important route to contribute to children exposure.
And we've time for one more question. And I would like you to share with us what you are most excited about. What do you think we can achieve in the next 5 to 10 years?
5-10 years, yes. That's a nice question. So I'm very excited about all these new tools that we have today and that we are developing to capture the complexity of the exposome and how this shapes our health. And I'm confident that the things that we learn by studying the exposome can change public health and clinical medicine for the better. So today we know that genes are not the most important determinants for many common diseases. For example, one example is diabetes. And every day we appreciate more and more how large is the contribution of environmental exposures to diseases. In many occasions, it is even larger than the contribution of our genes. And we cannot really change our genes, right? But we can intervene and change dangerous environmental exposures. So today we have some advanced technologies and methodologies to study the exposome and identify new environmental hazards. And in the future, I think we will also be able to use this information and scientific knowledge to make as well clinical decisions, similar in the way that we use today information, for example, about patients' genes to decide about clinical interventions and possible treatment plans. In the future, we will be able to consider also environmental exposures in these decisions, thanks to the exposome approaches that we are using and developing today. And I think that this is really exciting.
Yes, great. We will be excited about bringing this research into the clinic. Well, thank you, Dr. Valvi. Before we close, we'd ask you to complete an evaluation survey. We'll put the link in the chat and email it to those who registered. I hope you will join us next Wednesday for a talk with Dr. Michael Hadley on air pollution and heart health. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all.